from this Istanbul, Turkey incident. What actually happened? What's going on? What does this mean for U.S.-Saudi relations? Benjamin Friedman is with us. He is a lecturer at George Washington University. He's a graduate of Dartmouth, and he has, he's a researcher at the Center for Defense Information. Good morning, Benjamin Friedman. Welcome to Big 550 KTRS.
Morning. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so we need a little bit of a primer here. Let's go back. The U.S. and the Saudis, is it safe to say that we are the best of friends? We're pretty good friends.
No.
Both parties have done quite a bit to be friends with the Saudis over the years.
Yeah, the Saudis pump a lot of oil and make a lot of money and spend a lot on lobbying. And it's been a strategic decision of the United States in some ways to maintain close relations with them in order to influence them in keeping oil prices to some extent where we'd like them to be. And that's sort of how we got into bed with this regime, which has always been very bad on human rights and has been particularly bad since this crown prince took power within the last 2 years.
It seems like we forget that 15 of the 19 hijackers in 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. We also seem to forget that they blew up our Air Force base in 1996, and military men died and hundreds were wounded, and yet we still remain the best of friends with them, but we vilify Iran.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Saudis didn't themselves, the rulers didn't blow up our Air Force base, but they've been tolerant, certainly, of jihadists and radicals and have cracked down to an extent, but allowed still money to flow out of that country into the hands of extremists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda type people in other countries like Syria. And they aside from being brutal to their own dissenters and suppressing women's rights, I think have been a source of instability in the Middle East by what they've been doing in funding radicals and their brutal war in Yemen. And we blame the Iranians for everything, but most of the criticism that people in Washington, the president, and so forth, level at the Iranians, you could really say the same or worse of the Saudis.
So that's the sticky wicket we're in. We sure do like our cheap oil. We don't want the oil spigot cut off, and yet can we just stand and watch them murder this man in a foreign country and not do nothing?
Yeah, I don't think we have to. The oil supply is something the Saudis are stuck producing. I mean, they're stuck producing oil because they're dependent on it. So they try to manipulate price to maximize their profits. They do that. They've always done that. But they're not going to shut down oil supply, and they're not as big a part of the global oil market as they used to be. The United States produces more of its own energy these days than ever, but we're not even dependent really on them for the price of oil as much as we were. So I think we have more room and more rope to give them a hard time and separate ourselves from them than is often acknowledged.
One of the tenets of foreign policy over the last, since World War II at least, has been our defense of human rights and of promotion of democracy. Is that changing under President Trump?
President Trump more openly allies himself rhetorically and sort of personally with autocrats, not just the Saudis, but obviously Putin famously, and the Turkish leader Erdogan until recently. So he kind of likes those guys. But United States foreign policy has always been mixed on that front. We've been advocates certainly for liberalism and human rights, but also had to make do with dictators and despots and compromised on human rights. I think sometimes in situations where we didn't have to, where we thought, the countries in South America and so forth were in danger of being taken over by communists. We had to put up with murderous rulers. I think we have more ability to advocate for human rights than people acknowledge because we're pretty safe in the United States. We're not actually very dependent on people like the Saudis, contrary to a lot of conventional wisdom.
But it seems like the Trump administration is much friendlier to the Saudis than they are to, say, the Canadians and or Trudeau up in Canada. He's been much more harsh in his rhetoric towards Trudeau than he has towards the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an embarrassment. I think that the sword dance that the Trump cabinet officials did when they went over there at the beginning of the Trump administration and President Trump's early trip to Saudi Arabia were sort of embarrassments. And Mike Pompeo's trip the other day, where he's smiling and laughing with the Crown Prince on film, should embarrass him because even if you think we have to do business with the Saudis, we don't have to treat them as if we're sort of the vassals visiting the king and kind of bow down before them in their oil wealth. It's sort of disgusting, honestly. So I think we can give them a harder time. We don't have to turn them into our enemy. We just don't have to sell them as many weapons and help them prosecute wars in Yemen and treat them as close allies rather than just another country that we'd like to see behave better.
Hillary Clinton got into a lot of criticism for some Saudi princes giving money to the Clinton Foundation during the administration. Now we're starting to look a little bit harder at Donald Trump's dealings with the Saudis and the financial dealings he's had over the last 20 years. Is he compromised? Will he be able to sort of put what's in the best interest of America first as opposed to his own interests?
Well, this is another example, it's not the only one, where we have to ask what effect is the flow of money into his businesses having on his foreign policy decisions or the past investments that he got before he was president. And I think if there's enough political pressure on him, he's likely to give up on maintaining potentially lucrative flows of money into his hotels the Saudis have been providing. But I think in some ways he's compromised. At least there's the appearance of compromise, which is why it's such a shame that he became president and didn't divest himself of these businesses. It's a massive conflict of interest.
Benjamin Friedman with us. He has worked as a defense analyst at the Cato Institute and is researcher at the Center for Defense Information. Ben, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you. It's actually defense priorities these days that I work for.
I apologize.